Allow people to join us, and I will put up the screen share. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see such a great turnout today. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland Community Forum, Sunday morning community forum. That's a mouthful. Today we have a really good program to start off the year. And to introduce our speakers and our topic, I'm going to turn this over to Susan Alcorn, who is the chairperson of the forum committee. Susan, take it away. Susan, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, all right. Nice to see everybody. I wish I could see everybody. I wish we could be together in person, but that's not possible today. But the one thing we can really deliver is a good discussion on our topic, QAnon. We chose this topic because we definitely need to know more about it, given all of the divisiveness that we are experiencing right now. One thing we do know, it is very diverse, full of bits and pieces and information. It's very diverse, and it's been described as a domestic terror threat, a deep state political cult, and even a new religious faith based on divine revelation. In today's New York Times, they have a big article on it, and they mention left-wing yoga moms, anti-lockdown libertarians, and stop the steal Trumpists. So we need to have our questions answered on this, and as we move into the challenges of 2021. I'd now like to introduce our two speakers this morning. I'll begin with Dr. Allan Georgia. Dr. Georgia, and I'm going to call him Allan from now on, is the director of our religious education and lifespan faith development here at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. Having been a professor at various seminaries, Allan currently teaches religious courses at Case Western, at John Carroll, and at Ohio Wesleyan universities. He has either attended or graduated from 6 different universities and colleges, including Oxford University in England. Allan describes himself in various ways, including as a lifelong learner, and he loves to investigate, teach, collaborate, and preach. I can tell you from my personal experience that Allan has real curiosity about all things religious and secular, and it's absolutely endless. So that's a quick picture of Allan. I'm going to switch now to Dr. Timothy Beal, and he wants me to call him Tim also, Timothy, so I will. And so Dr. Beal is the head of the Department of Religious Studies at Case Western. And he's a very, very profound academic and scholar, having written 15 books. My favorite is Roadside Religion, and that's been recognized by recognized by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many other organizations. And so, in addition to scholarly articles, he has written on various aspects of religion for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Harper's. He's also appeared at various times on NPR and CNN, again, on various aspects of religion. So we're very pleased and grateful to have both of these speakers talk to us today about QAnon. And Tim, Allan, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll get the discussion going, and we'll switch back and forth, and it'll all work out. Okay? Thank you.
Susan, one more item for the audience. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A button, and you can do that at any time, and as soon as you think of it, and they will eventually get to our speakers and be answered.
That's absolutely true, and we'll really concentrate on that when we get to the Q&A section around 10 o'clock-ish. But absolutely, put your comments and questions in there. Good point.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for both being here and for this opportunity to jump into a topic that is as contemporary as it can be, as well as complicated as it can be. I think as Tim and I discussed before this, I have a little bit of a short kind of setup, and I think Tim does as well, and then we're going to kind of have more of a conversation because goodness, there's so much here that it would be impossible to try to address this in any kind of systematic way or try to address this more definitively. One thing I wanted to make sure that we were at least all on the same page about is just precisely what we're talking about with sort of what Q is and what the Q worldview is, not least because the reporting on this is developing and developed in different ways in different contexts. And sometimes those have not always included just like a top-down view. So through my own understanding of putting this all together, if you're thinking about the worldview that a QAnon supporter would have, I'm imagining a person who is primarily concerned with the idea that there is a vast secret war happening behind the scenes of our entire public life. And the essence of that war is that there is a sort of cabal. That's always the word that the articles have been using, a cabal of global elites, including your Barack Obamas and your Hillary Clintons, but also, you know, I assume every Hollywood actor and any other sort of generally famous person you can think of is probably wrapped up in this. And they are certainly wrapped up in maintaining the status quo of world government, but they also entail a range of nefarious practices that include, but are not limited to, pedophilia and cannibalism, including perhaps the consumption of infant blood because of a drug in it that allows them to stay young and vibrant. That's one side of the secret war. The other side is the sort of truth-telling and truth-fighting side. Righteous men and women who are now led by Donald Trump as the sort of chief of those fighters. Though there are some strands of Q, just to really show off the diversity, that believe that a never deceased John F. Kennedy Jr. is actually behind the scenes pulling the strings. Though I should note that depending on which QAnon supporter you would talk to, that claim might be completely plausible or totally ridiculous, depending on who you spoke to. But I also want to note this as sort of an internet phenomenon, and the fact that this is very much coming out of digital spaces in particular. Those areas of the internet associated with 4chan, which is frequently in the news as a kind of right wing and especially kind of the most extreme forms of the right wing sort of gathering place, was the originator of the Q pronouncements. But they've now moved to a website called 8kun, which used to be 8chan, which is owned and operated by some figures who are part of the Q movement outside the United States. And so Q is basically the name or an identifier for this information sharing entity. I mean, I don't know a more generic way to put it, who's dropping these breadcrumbs, as they call them, in these drops. A thing I want to note as a person who's interested in sort of the religious dimension of this is I read through some of the Q drops. And a thing to note is that in the culture, you might find some things that are kind of more classically sort of religious, like numerology associated with like Trump's tweets, or kind of very cryptic interpretations of public things like that. But that the actual Q drops themselves are, I don't want to quite say incoherent, but they are not documents that can exist without interpretation. Like there's no way you could go forward with these as if they were very straightforward. So interpretation is sort of built in. Just to sort of tie some things together, I just also want to note that if anyone was aware of the Pizzagate Conspiracy in the 2016 sort of election, this is associated with the John Podesta email hack and some of those things. That's part of the it's like a predecessor to the Q movement, but is very much wrapped up in a similar worldview. Um, and I also want to note that an important thing, and we should absolutely talk about this more, Tim, is kind of how to identify the ideology that's behind this, because it's not precisely political. It definitely does not break down in sort of standard right versus left political or kind of social orientations, because this really comes from all different kinds of groups, and you might have gotten to Q through other kinds of I'm trying to think of a way to characterize these, but I would just say it's groups that are skeptical of official or institutional knowledge. So, for example, climate change deniers, or like the anti-vax movement, or things like that. So I just want to make sure we at least have a broad picture. Of course, there's a lot of things that go in many directions, but I wanted to start there, and then I'll pass it to you, Tim, and you can fill us out as well before we get into a discussion.
Thank you, Allan, and thanks to UU of Cleveland for welcoming me back. Probably most of you don't know, but I came for an adult ed class many years ago to talk about actually roadside religion, which, by the way, is published by your press, Beacon Press, the Unitarian Universalist press. But great to be with you, Allan. And Allan also teaches for our department, Biblical Studies introductory course, and is going to be starting that soon. I'm sorry that we don't get to hang out over in the new Van Aken Marketplace and talk face to face, but hopefully that will come. Nice to see quite a few folks from Montview Boulevard Presbyterian Church as well. My wife Clover is co-head pastor there. That's in Denver. And so good to see a bunch of you in the participants list too. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think it is so important in a lot of ways, not just specifically related to QAnon. We in churches and other communities should be thinking about the rise of new religious movements, NRMs, as we like to call them in academic religious studies. This is a huge phenomenon, and probably doesn't get as much attention as it should. And then more specifically, the rise of white supremacist new religious movements and other movements. One of the things that I would really want to emphasize, I spent some time looking at the biblical influences and the ways these white supremacist movements are very much tied to a tradition called Christian identity and are all about biblical interpretation. I think it's really important for us to realize how Christian and how biblical so many of these movements are, whether in the most superficial, obvious ways or in more subtle ways. So I hope we can keep thinking about that. Obviously, this is quite a week. I mean, Allan, I know you, so I won't suspect you of, having some special powers of prediction to have chosen this this topic on this particular weekend. But I mean, we're all very conscious of some of these militia movements, of QAnon, of other movements and activities going on. We're anxious about it, and we're curious about it too. So it's great to see so many people here. Again, I think one thing I want to really emphasize is that I would argue anyway that fundamentally and at core, these movements really are religious movements, even when they don't talk about God or the Bible or whatever. And I think when we ignore or play down or dismiss the religious dimensions of these movements, which oftentimes you'll see in the op-eds and in political science analyses of them, well, that's just a kind of superficial dimension to them. I think that that's a big mistake. I think that this is something that's core to them and that we really can't understand them unless we pay attention to the religious dimensions. And we've made this mistake before. Think about Jonestown, think about Heaven's Gate, think about the Branch Davidians and that fiasco in Texas. In most of those cases, we can certainly say that our lack of understanding of them as religious movements had something to do with the tragedy and the disaster that happened. And as religionists, which I want us all to think of ourselves as religionists today, we don't shy away from or dismiss the kind of the weird and the scary and the disturbing dimensions of religion. We take them seriously as religion, as meaning-making projects, to put it in a kind of one very simple way of thinking about what religion is. I like the Roman playwright's statement, I am human, therefore, Terence, I think, I am human, therefore nothing human is foreign to me. Nothing human is alien to me. That's the kind of faith that we stake our work on as religionists. Is this is a human thing, we can understand it. We can't just dismiss it out of hand as crazy or as demon possessed. We have to try to understand how it is operating as a kind of meaning-making project for the people who identify with it. So just a couple comments generally about these kinds of movements, and then a little bit about QAnon, and then I look forward to a more interactive conversation. I would say first, in general, a few things that are features, that tend to be features of these kinds of movements. One is that they are, and this is something that's hard for us on the left to recognize and acknowledge, they are very systematic, and they are, I would say, in some sense, intellectual. They are highly kind of systematic, detailed ideologies, that is to say, very systematic worldviews. The psychologist Stephen Lewandowski says that they are self-sealing. They claim to be able to make sense out of everything. And so when you're within them, you're sort of self-sealed off, and it all makes sense within it. From the outside, it might not, but from the inside, it does. And they're often highly complex. And that's part of what the appeal is, I think, for a lot of the Anons in QAnon is, the interpretive activity around these cryptic statements. So that's one thing. They're systematic, they're ideological. Second, they tend to be apocalyptic. And by apocalyptic, I don't mean, necessarily tied to the book of Revelation, although they often are, but I mean that they have this sort of self-understanding of being tapped into a kind of revelation that decodes what's going on in the world in a way that other people aren't seeing. Apocalypse literally means revelation, out of covering or from covering. So does revelation mean that. Allan, you said there's this vast secret war, and that's often what apocalyptic thinking does. You're looking around and you're seeing the left and the right, or you're seeing, this country and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And now all of a sudden, through this lens, we realize, oh, this is actually a cosmic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between God and the devil. And we are actually participating in this cosmic battle on the side of the forces of good. And it's not just another battle, it's leading toward a kind of culmination of all things, a final battle, after which there will be some sort of, new era. So we're right on the cusp of history, and we're right in the middle of it. So that's the second thing. They're apocalyptic. Third, they're what we would call locative. That is to say, they locate us. When we identify with them, it's like, this is where you are in history. This is where you are in the world. And you are sort of located and identified with, the center of history in that sense. And this is also where they are. They might just look like political opponents, but they're actually, nefarious and even supernaturally evil over against us and what we're identifying with. So it's locative in that way. It helps us see where we are in the world and see where we are in history. This is our past, we're here, and the future is coming, right? And then the fourth is that they tend to be what I would call, I talk about this in my book about Revelation, othering machines. They work to identify us versus them, and the them is really monstrosized, is elevated to this kind of supernatural otherness that is beyond just, somebody you don't like or somebody you don't agree with, but so other and so diabolically other and monstrously other that we can do violence to them. And in fact, it's our obligation to. So this kind of othering that allows us to objectify and do violence to other human beings. And I think at the core of so many of them, Allan, you were saying, like, what is the ideology behind this? I would raise the possibility that, at least for a lot of them, the core of it is anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. And that's the other behind the others, oftentimes in these movements. And in that respect, it has a lot of history behind it. QAnon in particular, just a couple comments about that, and I'm really no expert about it. By the way, if you want a quick sort of weigh in, there's a film called The Fall of the Cabal that you can find if you look for it under that title, 10-part film that really sort of walks through a particular version of the QAnon theory, starting a ways back. And it also includes a lot about John F. Kennedy Jr., as well as Trump and Melania in it toward the end. But if you want to sort of try to understand, how this is working for people, I think that might be a place to start. So a couple comments about QAnon. One, and Allan, you said this too, that that the comments of Q, the posts or the drops that Q, the fall of the Cabal, C-A-B-A-L is how they spell Cabal. Allan, you said that they need interpretation. They don't, in fact, some of Q's earliest posts were just numbers and nothing else. They were literally cryptic. I like to think of this as a kind of generative incomprehensibility. It's incomprehensible. It makes no sense on its own, but there's something about it that generates interpretive activity and excites a community to try to make sense out of these cryptic, to decode this encoded language. And so within QAnon, the anons, that is the followers, the anonymous followers of Q, take these drops, these posts, as encoded messages, breadcrumbs, as Allan said, and see their job as being to decode them and interpret them and make sense of them in relation to history. And I think in some sense, Q has come to be seen as this perspective that sees all of history at once. The film I mentioned talks about maybe Q is moving back and forth in time between past, present, and future, and therefore is able to sort of see history in this comprehensive way. So that's one, this generative incomprehensibility. Second, that what really strikes me, having done a lot of work on the Book of Revelation and the cultural history of Revelation, is how similar the Q posts are in some ways to the Book of Revelation. They're cryptic, they're incomprehensible. Just try to read the Book of Revelation sometime. I mean, it does need interpretation, as Allan said, in the same sense. And throughout history, it's been taken as this kind of encoded map of history, of the whole history of creation. And if you can just understand it, then you can see, for example, these are the dispensations, and we're now in the final, sixth dispensation before the seventh sabbatical dispensation or whatever. All of these different ways of understanding, often visualized, which is interesting because a lot of the QAnon interpretations are these complex visual graphics and maps and charts using Q posts to understand the world. So the connections with Revelation are interesting. I think what's happening now, in some way, in the more explicitly Christian religious pieces of QAnon, is that the Book of Revelation and Christian apocalypticism is kind of integrating into Q. And so you have history that we're in the middle of, you've got the Q posts, and then which is like a new scripture, and then you've got the Bible, but especially the Book of Revelation, but the Bible, and they're each interpreting one another. They're being sort of integrated into this whole worldview that's highly systematic and complicated and self-sealing, as we said before. So I just want to close by saying, like, back to I am human, therefore nothing human is foreign to me. How can we, from a more, I guess I would put it as a sympathetic, in some sense, approach, how do we understand this? How do we, and I think understanding is about seeing how something can be true for someone according to a certain narrative within a certain world and context. That's what understanding is. So how do we understand this? What is this? How is this working for people? I think that just as a start in that conversation, it's powerful for its adherents in several ways. One, it makes, if I'm an adherent, it makes me feel like and really be confident that I am in the center of history. I am on the cusp of the dawning of a new era that all of history has been moving toward in some sense. That gives me meaning and purpose. It tells me this is where we've been, this is where we are, and this is what's coming next. It puts me in a narrative context. Cornel West, in a fantastic conversation with Chris Hedges that Clover just shared with me last night, talks about how many people are kind of despairing for a lack of a story. The old neoliberal narrative of progress doesn't feel true at all. Nihilism isn't a good alternative. And in some sense, these are stories that help us sort of locate ourselves. So we feel like we're at the center of history. It's powerful also for adherents in sort of identifying with good and developing a very sort of clear black and white understanding of what's evil, good versus evil in this kind of cosmic radical sense, and we're on the good side and they're on the evil side. And then I think it gives us a sense of insider identity. In other words, we who are part of this, we see it. The rest of the world is still blind to it, right? And that's always a very powerful appeal, powerful rhetoric of a movement. The Gospel of John does that, right, Allan? We all see it, the others don't. The Book of Revelation does that. We find that in Christian tradition, mainstream Christian tradition as well. So I just want to encourage us to think about what is powerful about this, and how does this work for people? How does this make sense? And then we can talk about, the New York Times article this morning talking about how does someone ever break out of this? And I think about, having grown up in a more fundamentalist leaning Christian context, for many, it is when that self-sealing system starts to fall apart from the inside. It's usually not by someone breaking in from the outside and saying, that's not true, and these predictions are false, and they never happened, and whatever, but it's from the inside beginning to ask questions and notice inconsistencies, and to start to see actually the system deconstruct from the inside, which can be scary too. And we should be aware of the terror of someone going through a counter conversion in some sense out of that sort of movement. And then Alan's question about, how do we identify the ideology when there are people from the right and the left? And I mean, this is it's a very diverse movement too. And that's part of what probably is powerful about it. So I'm going to stop there. I talked longer than I anticipated, but looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you so much for those comments, and it's very educational and gives us some perspective on what we're dealing with. We're now getting ready for Q&A, questions and answers. So I want you to look for the Q&A button either at the top or the bottom or the side of your computer or your smartphone. And if your question is chosen, we'll recognize you by your first name unless you hit the anonymous button. And while we're talking about computer buttons, I want to mention the chat button, because if you are not already on our forum list and you want to receive reminders of our upcoming forums, give us your name and email, and we'll send you a reminder. It's simple and easy. So anyway, I now want to turn it over to Debbie Wright and Laura Imbernoni members of our forum committee and co-chairs of our Q&A session. So they will choose the questions that you've typed in via your Q&A button. So with that, I'm looking forward, as all of us are, to the discussion.
Well, I'll go first. I didn't know, were you two finished talking with each other? If you had more to say on what each other has said, or do you want me to really go to a question?
Well, I'm sure I can talk with Tim for hours, so that's no problem. But as I was looking at the questions, actually the very first question I see is a good one to answer a question and also further the conversation, if that's okay.
That is fine, Alan.
Which is this is coming from Jim Rich, which is the appealing question, or like what's the sort of the appeal. And so let me do a little bit of backtracking to also just say, first off, to definitely magnify, Tim, your words about religion as an important critical category are ones I just want to really emphasize, because it's something I find myself advocating for a great deal. Is we live in a world where, especially among just kind of generally liberal secular sources, man, we just pretend religion doesn't exist, and we just really want to kind of so actually in preparation for today, I actually returned to Jonathan Z. Smith, famous religious scholar from the University of Chicago, who wrote one of the earliest takes on Jonestown that I know of from like a religious studies perspective, and was such a watershed for exactly these sort of, these things are active, they're part of our world now. So I'm really glad to have this chance to kind of bring those elements into the larger conversation. And with that in mind, to this question about why is QAnon appealing, I had an interpretation that I came across and also formulated, kind of collaboratively as I was reading more and more about this, around this question of what the draw-in is about this, and it was compelling, not least because it really taps into, Tim, your point about the othering machine that this can be, because of course one of the things that from any outsider's point of view that seems bizarre is, like, if you were going to create a mythology about a secret war of good versus evil, why, for any possible reason, would you choose Donald Trump as your messianic sort of figure? And the two things that I sort of noticed about this, one is that in evangelical circles, the biblical figure he's been most attached to is actually David. And he's been really kind of interpreted, of course, in this now redolent in the Gospels and everything, to interpret him as David is basically to interpret him as Jesus as well. But of course, David has this convenient adulterous history to kind of account for things. But one of the compelling sort of examples for why this would be appealing that I really saw and was really kind of remarkable to me was, in some ways, as we all kind of saw in the 2016 election, Trump's success was surprising. And I think if you're a conservative, perhaps he was a surprising sort of, a lightning rod. So if you have this victory in your hands and it doesn't take the form of what you want, in an interesting way, framing this with that apocalyptic imagination and turning this war into one in which, the stakes are literally child-eating, lizard people who are just, in charge of everything, becomes a very good way to couch Donald Trump's very mundane weaknesses into kind of something that's more manageable and sort of easier to swallow. And I think about that as an interesting sort of I think of your book, Tim, come up with any number of contemporary monster movie examples of how do you kill a monster? Well, you get a bigger monster, kind of thing. And so I sort of wondered if that is one way forward to answer sort of what the appeal is to see this in relief to Trump.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Alan. I agree with you, and in some sense, like it's inexplicable, and therefore there must be something supernatural about it, right? It's the only way to understand how this could be happening this way. And yeah, David, and then the other that we often hear about in evangelical circles is Cyrus of Persia, who was the king of Persia, who defeated the Babylonians and enabled the Jerusalemite people to return to Jerusalem after they'd been, conquered and exiled by the Babylonians in 587. So in 535, Cyrus of Persia conquers it, and Isaiah calls Cyrus a Mashiach, a Messiah. He's the one who is anointed by God to fulfill God's will for God's people. And so sometimes he's also identified with Cyrus as a kind of heathen who is an instrument of God and a messianic figure. But yeah, it is fascinating. What do you make of the intense focus on sort of really truly of disgustingness, of impurity, of profanation in the descriptions of the child eating and the sex trafficking of children and all of that, because that seems to be the other side of this elevation of Donald Trump.
Well, for sure, and I love you. The Cyrus example is a great one, and because you brought up the anti-Semitic element of this before, I always have to laugh. It's really not Christian anti-Semitism if it doesn't also include an identification with Israel. It always has to be both ways.
Always.
The Jews are terrible, but we're also the real Jews. Is kind of the logic of it. So and of course, thinking of that logic, that's going back to the Middle Ages. Of course, that's those kinds of disgusting practices are what make these insidious people who we have to be around. And I also think back to, you brought up Terence before, just how long it is the tradition in political invective. This was something early Christians had to wrestle against, this similar rumors of blood consumption and child abuse or use in these nefarious ways. It's interesting how these are our things to go back to. This is maybe a strange take on it, but I was weirdly, this was very, very early on in the Trump administration, but I had read a psychologist's take about how strongmen figures are usually attached to an overly developed concern for animals and babies. And the example that the person actually drew up was how Tony Soprano is portrayed in The Sopranos. He loves the ducks so much, and he's always concerned about little babies, and Trump is that way too. So it's interesting to see this as just as we were saying before, it's like the extremist version of what we can accuse people of. So I wonder if that might be part of the logic behind that. These are all, this is a good example of a thread where we could chew on this for so long without end.
Yeah.
So, you want to go, Laura? You can go.
Sure. I'll start with the next one. So Ed is pointing out that a large number of people in the United States have a belief in creationism. And he's wondering if that sort of belief opens the door to social acceptability for conspiracy theories that we find in QAnon.
Interesting. Tim, you spent so much time talking about the back end of the Bible. This is really a front end of the Bible kind of a question. But maybe a similar logic to what you were describing in Revelation.
I wonder if one connection could just be a predisposition to distrust mainstream authorities. So, for example, science, when it comes to geological history and versus creationism, a distrust of our mainstream government-supported education systems, and not only our public schools, but also our universities. I certainly pick up a lot of, distrust and skepticism about higher education, institutions of higher education around the fringes of some of the QAnon stuff and some others. So maybe that's a piece of it. I don't know how much overlap there is between creationists and QAnon.
Well, this is a little bit tangential to creationism, but in a similar intellectual space. I did see this was a Comedy Central program, so this was not very official, but Jim Jeffries interviewing a group of Q followers, but who they had done a good job of making sure was a diverse group, and one of them was a flat earther. And the other Q supporters couldn't have been more embarrassed. they were like, dumbfounded that this flat earther had become part of their group or was, representing. So interestingly enough, you might find a lot of diversity around a question like this, where some, of course, if you are a flat earther, this might be a very plausible thing to you, but if you're coming at Q from a different angle, that's an absurd idea, and laughable, of course.
This is sort of a question that's I'm kind of put together here. It's about this sort of like, I'm human and therefore nothing human's foreign to me. So we're human. So there's somehow we have to understand these people who are the QAnon people. And I'm thinking about, as probably a leftist, believer in climate urgency, I live in a sort of self-sealing world myself, comforted by the science and the things that to someone who doesn't believe in science or doesn't understand science is magical thinking also. I believe in the sort of the great turning that Joan Macy talks about. I'm looking for I feel the lack of a story to understand the world I live in. So I look at someone like Octavia Butler, who's creating these stories. I mean, I think that maybe people in my camp are really not that different than the QAnon. It's just that I have a different story I believe on. Do you see those correlations, and what do you think about that?
I really appreciate you coming at that question from that perspective, and in a very self-reflective way, thinking about that. I identify with what you're saying personally, and we're in a world where it's hard to have conversations across those lines. I think in some ways, religious studies and contexts like that are some of the only spaces where we really try to understand, something so other to us, right? Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, so I actually almost want to approach this from the opposite direction, which is, I sort of take it for granted that, in fact, I can get in trouble too much if I talk about it in such a progressive circle as this. If we try to analyze ourselves, who knows what we'll find. But we certainly live in a self-sealing world with our own expectations that confirm themselves. The other side of this, though, that I have been thinking about is the kind of feedback mechanism that there is in the Q process to isolate and isolate and isolate, and that if you fall into this a little bit, in a very few moves, your family might stop talking to you, your friends might no longer have any interest in, and suddenly you become alone in this, which I think of because, of course, is a classic phenomenon in any kind of religious conversion or any kind of movement where people are becoming members and people are being disowned or sort of shooed away for those reasons. And I think about that because talking about religion writ large, of course, we're talking about these large motifs and themes and things like that. But I'm also thinking about the pietistic experience of being an evangelical who's used to doing your biblical meditation, who's used to doing your personal prayer and things like that, and now you're sitting in front of a glowing screen and it's 2 a.m. and the world is scary and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And this pulls you in not for intellectual reasons, but for these things that begin to answer, just as you described, Tim, an anxiety about a worldview that's open and that just things don't click, but how could these forces, these for them, any liberal progressive point of view is wrapped up in baby murder and the undermining of traditional society and all these other explicit things that you could never see as goods. So how do you make sense of that? And then this sort of draws you in. So that's a dimension of this that I just sort of, as I've been reading through this material, that the human element, don't want to lose track of the fact that there's a very real spiritual experience happening for these people, which does speak to an absence of that in other places. And I think that we are, especially in progressive sides of things, we are foolish if we eradicate, I don't want to say religion is the only possible way to do this, but if we eradicate these world explaining ways of dealing with the world and just expect everybody to cope with it and not deal with the outcome, which is some people will come up with extreme ways to close their world.
Well, we have that same desire for a story and revelation. It's just like, where do we get it from? You know what I mean? It's like, other than science fiction writers who attempt that, but I don't see that being attempted in the extreme environmental movement. But I do see people religious about it, the way they may sit in a tree for months on end, or the way they may hoard every piece of water that they find, or avoid plastics, or all the extreme mesh. It is the same kind of religious ferment, actually, that the QAnon people have, in my opinion. I mean, if you look at it from the outside, it's the same. It's because it's human. That's our desires as a human species.
Mm. And Debbie, the other side of that is the isolation that can lead to that feeling like the world around us is not responding to, not seeing the crisis that we're in. And
yeah.
Yeah.
So coming from these feelings, maybe somehow we can talk to these other people, but I don't know how that happens, but myself. Laura, I don't know if you're done with that, you can ask the next question, Laura.
Well, we do have a comment by Peter about a congresswoman that is a known believer in QAnon. And we hear that a number of people in Congress are either believers or influenced. It's sort of hard to tell whether that's real or not. But then we're beginning to hear there could be government employees, there could be members of the armed forces, police. So as we, as a country, govern ourselves, how do we deal with people in a position of power espousing these beliefs or being influenced by these beliefs?
You know, one of the ways I've seen this question iterated is the QAnon movement inherently violent? Like, in other words, is this sort of a built-in feature? In terms of, I mean, obviously, you know, we have people in, I assume, public office who believe very weird things in other directions that we probably think of as more harmless or not necessarily alarming. But of course, as we've seen with the Capitol revolt, and there's a number of in fact, I had a little list here of things. There's at least a handful of people been killed, including a mob boss was killed because of a QAnon related kind of interpretation that this person needed to be taken care of, and that was sort of one of the results of this. What it does occur to me is, depending on how you, Tim, your very good language before was that apocalyptic imagination centers us in history. So depending on how central you see yourself, I mean, if there really is a cabal of child eaters in charge of the world, not to call their bluff, but like, you probably should do something about that if that was actually the case. So I do wonder whether or not this is really compatible, and it's sort of like one of those issues we can just agree to disagree about, because you know, this sort of is what it is. I think the more problematic dimension for us in sort of the less extreme kind of, you know, protection of the Capitol and insurance the inauguration takes place and things like that, is that this entails a non-falsifiable way of looking at the world, and how do you engage? You know, one of the central claims, is that, you know, Hillary Clinton is a, you know, a pedophile or sort of a leader of pedophile rings. You know, I can't falsify that claim. There's like nothing I could possibly do to totally eradicate any version of that. I mean, you couldn't torture me into believing that she is. You know, that's just not something that corresponds with my understanding of reality. But at the same time, once you have opened the door to the kind of thinking which is so essential to all of these kinds of conspiracies, where an internal logic to a worldview is sort of present, I think, just as Tim said before, the only way out is some kind of a warming within that begins to break down some of those connections and some of the certainty that goes along with that. So with those people in places of power, I would not treat this as a simple disagreement myself. At least I wouldn't see it that way. I don't know about you, Tim.
It's kind of interesting that we also espouse as a country to have a strong desire for freedom of religion. So that would allow QAnon as an upcoming religious entity. More and more they're, you know, speaking religious language. And at the same time, do they believe in freedom of religion? And
Yeah.
so that gives us kind of a quandary.
And that's such a deep one, right? That's the whole history of the United States for sure. We want our religious freedom, but we're not so open to extending that. I wonder with QAnon in particular, is it kind of going to go away on its own? Did it begin as a kind of a ploy in some way with Pizzagate that has taken on a life of its own and become a kind of religion, whereas it began as a kind of a trick by some early people on 4chan. Some think it was part of that some people involved with a gaming company started it. But at any rate, I don't know if QAnon is going to go on and grow. I worry much more profoundly about if apocalypticism will ever go away, and whether that is something that's just deep in us as human beings, whether that is something that we have inherited from Christianity in a way that we just can't seem to get out from under. And then I do worry very much about anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, which I do think is core to so much of this. And again, that's a Christian inheritance that the church has never quite been able to come to terms with and get rid of. There was a piece by David Brooks maybe a week ago or less talking about how what's happening now politically is creating divisions within evangelical Christianity. And one of the things he suggested was, you've got the kind of core zealous adherents, and then you've got everybody else who are kind of interested. And his strategy that he was recommending there, I think, was something like, you've got to go after those ones, the zealots, and get rid of them. And if you don't, it's just not going to go away. But almost like surgical by force removal of some, and then hope that the rest of it goes away. But yeah, what do you think, Debbie?
That's a slippery slope there,
Yep. Very
No,
Not
much.
even. Oh.
When I was just going to say the other side of this is so much goes against instinct, because again, I'll start this from the back end and say, when I was younger, I was very critical of sports. I mean, that was without a doubt because I was a nerdy, non-athletic person in high school, so obviously I had every reason to hate it. But at the same time, now that we live in a world beset by misinformation and partisan, distinction and difference and all this kind of stuff that keeps us always arguing, I'm like, oh man, how great would it be to talk about just the Browns? To have, in other words, like one of the problems is that we are so obsessed with this, become so central to so many of us. There is no safe ground to meet on where you don't have to get into the details of the cabal that's in charge of the world, that would allow us to maybe address some of those isolationist instincts that come through this kind of thinking, and really would foster a thawing of some of these concerns. So I wonder whether or not there isn't a better way forward, that we should be I don't know, arguing about some other very, very much lower stakes issues that would allow us to engage with one another without having to get into some of these details. Because if the last few months have proven anything to us, is that even if there are people whom you disagree with, the way and manner in which they disagree with you matters to you as well. So.
Did you have a response, Tim, or next question?
Oh, what struck me about what you were just saying was, well, by the way, I'm definitely going to be watching the game in a few hours, but the way that I think the Biden administration is trying to do something like what you're saying, like, let's not talk about these things, pretty much ignoring most of that and saying, okay, war on the pandemic, that's the biggest war since World War II, and this is going to be our story. is addressing that and coming together around that, which I have to think, that the people in, working with that administration are thinking exactly what you're thinking, Allan.
Mhm. So question, what does Q stand for, and how far does it spread outside the United States?
I can jump on this sort of as a factual one. So a Q is apparently a clearance level in the American intelligence
Oh.
world. So Q level clearance describes access to. It's not the final most sort of fully classified, but it's up there in intelligence circles. So Q, and then the anon comes from. This is actually so one of the reasons why the 4chan world is so insidious is because it's one of the only places on the internet you get to be totally anonymous. So every time you sort of sign in, you are a new anon number. So to label the post's Q was to kind of identify the speaker, that this person was coming from there, and of course had this access. Of course, at the same time, it turns out the letter Q is as easily borrowed and used by anybody who doesn't actually have that clearance or has nothing to do with that. So it's easy enough to insinuate yourself. But that's at least where that marker comes from. Only because we asked this question. I will also, is just a funny thing, is that of course in biblical studies we have a different Q, which I actually raise because apparently this is part of just how evolving the QAnon world is that so Q is the also the hypothetical gospel that informs the Matthew and Luke gospels, who definitely borrowed from Mark, part of a sort of hypothesis about how the gospels evolved. But interestingly, I have learned that there are some Q supporters who actually started writing full-on book-length studies, and one is about the messianic Q, and that Q is actually a trans-historical phenomenon whose perfect iteration is Jesus, but that Q is an identity that can be passed through history by like a Cyrus or whoever the agent of good is in the world. This is like a very Gnostic kind of a history of sort of this eternal war of the state now is really part of a satanic struggle that goes throughout all of history. But as far as an actual like deeply tapping into biblical interpretive kind of worlds interpretation, starting with Q as sort of your primary basis and then kind of reading it back into this other motif. And all I can say about the power of that is I happened to read the thing about the woman who was shot in the Capitol during the riot. Her final words were screaming out from darkness to light, which is one of the QAnon signifiers, but also just exactly what I would expect a revolutionary Gnostic to scream out if they were storming the citadels of wherever. So in any case.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Someone took your intro class, Allan, clearly.
Yeah, apparently. They ran with it in a whole other direction.
The other thing interesting about that is that, what I understand about the Q gospel, the hypothesized, but it's so elaborately hypothesized that we have chapters and verses for it and everything. There's never been found such a thing, but people talk about Q chapter 4, verse whatever, and that kind of thing. But Q is hypothesized to be a collection of sayings with no narrative in it, very like the Gospel of Thomas. And so that's kind of interesting insofar as Q's really a string of utterances.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, all kinds of continuity here. It's funny.
Yeah, they may
outside the United States or strictly U.S. phenomena?
So I did a little reading about this, and apparently there's some resonance in the English-speaking parts of the international world, but not as much further flung. And an interesting thing about this actually is the anti-Semitism question. Of course, Europe has a much different history of dealing with anti-Semitism in its immediate history than America does, and that is a real. I mean, the anti-Semitism of this element of the conspiracy world is one of the earliest things that was on the internet as far as this kind of thinking goes. So it's interesting to wonder if that isn't like a prophylactic or something to this social reception of something like this. It turns out that if you've really lost your appetite for global cabals of Jews, ruling the world, then you sort of are suspicious of it in any other iteration. So,
Right.
Might this break them from fundamentalist Christians who've been really pro-Israel with the idea that it was going to bring on the apocalypse?
I don't think so. I think that fundamentalist Christian Zionism is the other side of the coin of anti-Semitism.
Oh, okay.
And throughout history, there's this kind of Judeo-philia that very quickly turns into anti-Semitism at certain moments. And a lot of it is much more that kind of Zionist thinking, pro-Israel thinking is also very supersessionist. It slips into this, we're the real inheritors of God's promise. We're the true children of God. The Jews forfeited their chosenness by rejecting Jesus. And so, yeah, I'd be cautious about that. People who study anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism are very wary of Christian Zionism in those ways. I was thinking too, Alan, I heard that it's getting popular in Germany, that it's the woman who did the Fall of the Cabal film, I think she's Dutch, but there's interest in it in Netherlands and in Norway, and then also very much in South and Central America.
Well, those, of course, you're describing all of the places, right, that in Europe are having this similar right-wing resurgence. So yeah, it's interesting to see those as kind of correlative, maybe not causative, but at least happening in gardens are growing together type of a situation. What I can say that at least why I note this is that there is some formal international functioning of this, because some of the most vocal Q people are self-exiles from the United States who have kind of set up in places like the Philippines. Jeffrey Jordan, I can't remember the name of the individual who owns this 8kun channel that all this happens on, and who possibly may be the actual Q, some people theorize, is one of these people who moved from the United States because of taxes or whatever, and now there's kind of a formal relationship between this sort of exilic culture of people who've left the United States. So that's another question, is sort of like how that's going to seed the world now, because they're in these other locales. But at the very least, well, let me put it this way: it seems as though there's no like Q. I'm sure Q people don't think well of Angela Merkel, but like there doesn't seem to be, the focus seems to be on American power and American spheres. So
that's true.
I've heard a number of people talk about how the isolation of this time due to COVID, it's brought about a certain global interest in global activities and more information than normal, and more impact of what's going on around us. And so I notice here that Mosey mentions this in relationship to QAnon, and asking, does the isolation and the politicizing of COVID, has it brought about a greater interest in QAnon as well as other events?
I'll just note that the New York Times article this morning that just, I mean, I was able to just browse it sort of quickly, but I was moved. I have some friends who still, I was in New York before I moved to Ohio, and I have some friends who are still there. And New York is a particularly isolating place to suffer from COVID, because of course everyone lives in a shoebox, and it's extremely close quarters. Everything's still closed because you sort of can't manage like we can in more spread out places to sort of have public areas that are safe. So all I can think of is this example of a woman who probably the rest of her life, because of the pandemic, really has, it's given her every reason probably to fall further into this. So I would see a strong correlation there. Tim, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I agree. And we can talk about the epidemiology of ideas and the spread of ideas and how they spread. And I think the media environment, the media ecology that we're in, that correlates with the isolation and these other things related to the pandemic, really is, and you used the garden image too, the gardens growing together too, Allan, but the ways these things spread and take hold in our current media ecology, that is partly an effect of the pandemic as well, is something that needs to be studied more. I think there's actually some really interesting work to be done in the computational space around what's called natural language processing and, tracking, for example, QAnon discourse. There's just been a little bit of work on that so far, but I think that's one way you could maybe pay attention to all of the data that you'd have to in order to see that kind of spread and growth and taking hold.
Just a little tag there, because I think you're absolutely right to point to that. And I found this actually from both sides, both the actual like how Q is spreading, but also if you want to really learn about Q. And I had to frustrate you, Tim, with this as one of my responses, that some of the best things on Q right now are actually podcasts. There's in fact a dedicated podcast called QAnon Anonymous that is at this point hundreds of hours long, and that's where I learned about the Q Messianic Secret book, and have done things, for example, like infiltrate Q seminars and sort of conventions and things, and really have been where things are diving deep. And then the other side of this is the meme culture on the internet, which is a strange thing because, I guess 5 years ago there was I Can Has Cheeseburger and kind of like dumb, very stupid, low level things like that. But that's now primarily the way in which most of this information is spread. And there very much is, talking about natural language, this has become a language unto itself, that's referential, and you have to know the formats of the memes usually in order to understand what's going on and whatever's sort of there. Some of these, of course, can be very low, like you could find them all over Facebook. Whoever's in the audience, you can find these easily on your own social network feeds. But in Q circles, this is going to be the main way in which people communicate sort of on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. So there's a whole sort of landscape of language to untangle here.
Nicholas asked a question that I think many people would be interested in hearing the answer to. And then Debbie will have the last question after this question from Nicholas. What do QAnon supporters think about the afterlife?
I don't know if there's a standard, although the woman who was shot gave a kind of Gnostic understanding, as Allan pointed out. I haven't read anything in particular about that. I think some of the anticipation, not of an afterlife, but of a new era, involves a kind of, very similar to the end of Book of Revelation, this sort of renewal of everything and the beginning of peace and no more war, and all of that, more of a this worldly paradise in some sense. But do you know anything about afterlife?
I have not seen anyone address this. Obviously, if you're an evangelical coming to QAnon, you come with a great deal of expectations about what happens in the afterlife. But actually, I think, Tim, your instinct is exactly the right one. This is an interesting way. I mean, apocalyptic thinking is always, the development of the concept of it. I mean, no early Christian believes in a heaven that you get in the Middle Ages until you're so distant from those apocalyptic ideas that you can metamorphose those into this personal salvific relationship. So interestingly, you can see this as almost like a backtracking of that back into the worldly space. So instead of it being kind of the abstract of the soul's ascent and sort of a heavenly perfect place, this could be more of a reseeding of salvation in to save the nation and to save the world, and to really in those much more worldly terms, which as I say it is perhaps absolutely terrifying, because the idea of a evangelical personal heavenly eschatology being realized in the world is not good news for non-evangelicals in the world, is all I can say. That being said, I love the idea of in some crazy scenario where QAnon is correct and I also get to go to heaven, I will look forward to the bizarre conversation I have with Donald Trump in the context of the pearly gates, because I have no idea what that conversation would look like.
So I guess the last question, this is from Patty, and she's kind of wondering, where do you get your information about QAnon? She's assuming sort of posts and blogs, but I also asked the same question because obviously with the loss of Trump as president, he's not going to go away. Where is QAnon going to go from here? And how would you track it? I mean, the average citizen.
Some nice introductory, there's a fairly long article in the Atlantic Monthly that was a while back now. I forget, maybe even in 2019, but that was one of the first kind of reports that went in some depth on it. If you want a sort of insider's perspective, that film I mentioned, The Fall of the Cabal, could be something to look at. And then there are a number of other articles. They all kind of provide the same few paragraphs of summary. As far as from a redaction critical perspective, you can kind of see they're all sort of using the same few paragraphs to describe it and then talking about some dimension of it on either side. I mean, if you really want to start researching, then you can find your way into the various sites that where followers are posting and social media. Allan, I think you know more about this than I do.
What I was absolutely going to say, this is just my own recommendation. Whatever you do not go to the places on the internet where QAnon just, I mean, if you try to go to 8kun or 4chan or any of these places, just expect to be called a lot of very nasty names, and just nothing good will happen there. What I will say is you can find the Q drops published elsewhere. Like you can find the text of them pretty easily. Like I think the New York Times has like a list of, like you can find them in some of their resources. So that is one thing to note. I had also brought up podcasts, of course, as a place where there's really a substantial body of people sort of responding to them. But and perhaps this is a good way to close a little bit with Debbie's final comment about sort of where it's going to go from here. And this is adapting from an entirely different context. We've been talking so much about early Christianity. Something I almost never do here at UUCC, by the way, so this has been a bizarre morning for me, is one of my favorite interpretations or sort of discussions comes from a New Testament scholar I really appreciate, whose take on the early Christian theological kind of world was that upon the death of Jesus, the early Christian community was, I'm going to get this quote not quite right, but he basically said the Christian community was faced with two possible options: despair or interpret, with the idea that, the death of Jesus could mean there was no way forward and that was the end of this, or there was some way to make sense of what had happened that still accorded with your worldview and there was some way forward. That is a strength and also a dangerous dimension of religious thinking. All of this is interpretable and re-applicable into a new context, and can, virus-like here in our pandemic time, evolve in any way. Tim, any takes on that just as to close us out?
Well, I thought of some of you probably know Annie Lamott, the writer, and in one of hers, she describes the disciples in the upper room after the crucifixion, hung over, looking at each other, saying, "We are so effed." She doesn't there. But and then despair or interpretation. But I think religion is always interpretation. It's always about meaning making on a current present horizon, inheriting tradition and interpreting it and trying to make sense out of it in new contexts. And that when we come at it that way, we begin asking different kinds of questions, which is, how is this community interpreting, and how are they making meaning? And I think that's at least a start in bridging the us versus them, self-other context that we find ourselves in so often.
Thank you so very much, both of you. We can't thank you enough. We've learned so much, and it's been such a good give and take discussion, and it just shows the complexity of what we're doing and the expertise and commitment you both have to being with us this morning, and to your own theologies and educational and attainments. So we appreciate that so much. I have a few announcements I would like to make this morning. Next week's forum is titled Mass Incarceration, Judges, and Reentry, an overview. And it's important because our mass incarceration and reentry programs are definitely a very important part of our community. Our speakers will be Erica Anthony, Executive Director of the Ohio Transformation Fund, and Crystal Bryant, Director of the Cuyahoga County Office of Reentry. This forum has been recorded. Today's forum, I should say, has been recorded, and it will soon be available on the Unitarian website, uucleveland.org. And if you want to see this recording, go to the website, as I said, and click on the large box there on the upper right-hand side, and it will take you there to the recording. And it will also take you to today's service at 11 o'clock this morning. And the topic of the service is the center. It's going to be centered on the third Unitarian Universalist principle, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth. That's certainly connected to today. The service will be conducted by YouTube. So again, click on the green box on the upper right-hand side of the website, uucleveland.org, and it will take you there at 11 o'clock. So again, we want to thank both of our speakers for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next Sunday at 9:30 for another great discussion. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.